My name is Brooke Edmonds. I'm with OSU Extension, and I'm in Lynn and Benton counties. And I've been organizing this webinar series. So today we are really grateful for having Dr. Gail Langellotto join us as our speaker. So I have a little bio that I'm going to read about her, and then I'll let her go ahead and share her screen. So an entomologist by training, Dr. Gail Langellotto coordinates the statewide Master Gardener program here in Oregon. Gail is also a professor in the OSU Department of Horticulture with research and teaching responsibilities. Her interests are focused on developing a better understanding of how to design and manage gardens and parks within urban and suburban landscapes to maximize ecosystem services such as pollination, pest control, and human health and well-being. Starting in 2017, she began working closely with master gardeners in home and community gardens to begin documenting garden biodiversity in Oregon, and will share some of her preliminary results with us today. So this is maybe a little bit different than some of our other webinars. This is more of a research, sort of a behind the scenes peek. So we're in the middle of telling the story basically right now. So I will let Gail just take a few moments here to share her screen and unmute her mic, and then she will take it away.
Thank you everyone for tuning in today. I love this project and I'm super excited to share with you some of our initial results from our garden bee research. So often acknowledgements go till the end of the talk, and then I always find that I'm rushed or sometimes I forget them. So I really want to take a moment to acknowledge folks and organizations that have supported our research thus far. So first I need to acknowledge and thank Isabella Messer, who's in the top right-hand corner of your screen right there. Isabella is an undergraduate at Oregon State University in the Horticulture Department. I think she's going to be a sophomore this year. And she is really the driving working force behind this project, without whom I would totally be lost. She also tolerates really long rides in the car with me to do the sampling. It takes about 4 to 6 hours in the car for 4 consecutive days, for 3 consecutive months every summer. So that's a lot of tolerating me that she has to do, in addition to preparing and pinning all of the bees. I also need to thank the Oregon Master Gardener Association for providing a small grant to identify the bees that are associated with this research. On average, it takes $3 to identify every bee by a museum level expert. So their support is helping us to make sure we get high quality IDs associated with all of our pollinators. And then I also have to thank Spike Wadsworth and Sherry Sheng, who are in the bottom of your screen there. Spike and Sherry have been very supportive of our research. Garden-based research is not a hot ticket for federal funding. So without Spike and Sherry's support, we really would not have been able to get this project off the ground. There are going to be 4 parts of this talk today. First, I'm going to give a little bit of a call for the importance of doing research in gardens, why it matters. And then I'm going to review what we know about research on garden bees to try to set the stage for some of the things we know that gardeners can do that can either invite bees in or exclude bees from their garden. Then I'm going to share some of the preliminary results of the garden bee sampling that we've been doing around Portland area gardens. And I'm going to close with some specific recommendations for what you can do to be more bee-friendly in your own garden, including recommendations for high-quality bee plants, specifically for those folks in Western Oregon. And just so you can keep track, I have these little tabs on the side so that you can know where we're at among the 4 parts of our talk today. So why is garden research important? Well, I argue that garden research is important because gardeners and landscapers manage a significant amount of land in the United States. If we take all of the gardens and all of the yards and add them up together, they constitute about 2% of total US land area on the mainland. That in and of itself isn't totally impressive, but when we think about urban land area, gardens and yards represent 25 to 30% of urban land area, and in most cities, gardens and yards represent more than 50% of the urban green space that can be found in a city or in a suburb. So paying attention to these spaces, which are privately managed by many, many different people, and giving recommendations for what we can do to make them more sustainable, more beneficial to things like urban cooling or urban biodiversity is something that is within reach and can have real impacts on, I would argue, a global basis. And of course, if you are a master gardener, you know that master gardeners have been tasked with disseminating research-based information. Here in Oregon, we field and answer about 100,000 plus questions from gardeners each and every year. So we are answering a lot of questions about how to manage gardens, and a lot of those questions are really focused on how to manage gardens so that they're more sustainable. I think it's a really exciting time to be a master gardener today, because today master gardeners have an opportunity not only to disseminate research-based information, but also to play an active role in the discovery of research-based information. So I have 3 projects which are kind of highlighted here. The Oregon Bee Project is a project which is managed by Andoni Melathopoulos, and an aspect of the Oregon Bee Atlas, the Oregon Bee Project, is to train volunteers to contribute to this Oregon Bee Atlas to get a sense of Oregon's pollinator health, focused specifically on 2 pollinator groups, the leafcutter bees as well as the bumblebees. And I know that many of the master gardeners who might be listening to this webinar today are active in the Oregon Bee Atlas. The center photo is a photo from a project that Brooke manages, and that's vegetable variety trials, working with Lynn and Benton County master gardeners in Oregon. So Oregon State used to have a list of recommended vegetable varieties where they would take the size, they would take the yield, they would take data on the taste of all of these different vegetables, until it became too time-consuming for the researcher at OSU to manage that project. So Brooke and the Benton and Lynn County Master Gardeners stepped in to fill that void, and now we once again have recommended OSU vegetable varieties because of their active participation in that research. And then I know that some Oregon master gardeners also participate in COCO-RAS, which I absolutely love that name. COCO-RAS stands for the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network, where basically they just give master gardeners a rain gauge or a snow gauge, and you give information on a regular basis about the local climate in your yard so that folks can who are managing that research project can get a better understanding of Oregon's climate and potential climate change. So when I mentioned that master gardeners are tasked with giving research-based recommendations to the general public focused on sustainable gardening, something that I've noticed over the last decade or so is that a lot of those recommendations were discovered and derived from research that was conducted in commercial agricultural systems. And of course, commercial agricultural systems are very different both in scope and scale compared to home garden systems. So on the right of your screen there, I have pictures of cotton fields from when I used to work in California, working on California cotton, which was so hot and fairly oppressive. So even when the cotton growers did do something like plant a sunflower edge along the border of their cotton fields, for the most part, cotton fields were nothing but cotton planted in 1 mile by 1 mile blocks of nothing but cotton, which you can see in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Gardens, by comparison, I have 2 of the study gardens that I'm working in Portland, photos from them on the left-hand side of your screen. They tend to be much smaller, and they tend to be much more diverse in terms of their plant diversity compared to commercial agricultural systems. And I would argue that this can contribute to recommendations that come out of the Master Gardener program derived from research in commercial cropping systems that aren't necessarily appropriate to the scale and scope of home gardens. So one example that I'll share with you is the master's research of Michael Nelson, who recently graduated from my lab. And what Michael did is he went and tested the soils of 27 master gardener managed vegetable gardens in Corvallis, Oregon, as well as in the Portland, Oregon area. And what he did is he measured every possible soil parameter that you could measure for these different vegetable gardens. And he compared these different soil parameters, whether it's organic matter or electrical conductivity, which is a measure of the saltiness of the soil, nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. He compared the levels that master gardener managed gardens had in their soil, and he compared these against recommended publications, which listed the recommended ranges for these different parameters. So the thing that I want to point out here is that for almost every parameter that we looked at, master gardener managed gardens had an excess of organic matter. And organic matter was on average 4 times the recommended rate from vegetable production guides. Master gardener managed gardens also had an excess of phosphorus, and one of the soil scientists who was on Michael's master's thesis committee mentioned, you know, if you want to get people to back off on adding in so much organic matter, so many nutrients, maybe you should let them know that at these high levels of phosphorus, which on average were 10 times the recommended rate, you're killing off a lot of the soil beneficial microbes. If we look at things like calcium and magnesium, in some cases, master gardener managed gardens were 40 times the recommended rate for these particular nutrients. So what we think is happening here is that it really comes down to an issue of scale. When you're telling a commercial farmer to raise their organic matter by 1% across a 1 mile by 1 mile field, if they can actually achieve that 1% increase in organic matter, they're thrilled. But if you have a gardener who's working in a very small garden bed, and our recommendations, at least in the Oregon Master Gardener Program for many years, has been just add organic matter to make your soil healthy, you can quickly go to the point of having excessive organic matter contributing to excessive soil nutrients and excessive micronutrients, which potentially, in some cases for things like phosphorus, can have negative impacts on soil microbes and or might be washing off from garden soils and contributing to watershed pollution. So, but we wouldn't have known that unless we actually tested these garden soils. So I would argue that there are a lot of really cool and important things that we can learn about sustainable gardening just by doing the research. However, as I mentioned at the start of this talk, when I thanked our supporters, funding for garden-based projects is pretty slim. So if we look at the allocation of federal funds through the Specialty Crop Research Initiative, which was founded to support projects that included ornamental horticulture, we can see that only 2% of the projects, only 2 projects since 2008, have included a consumer horticulture component, a gardening component. Almost all of the projects have instead been focused on production agriculture, so production of commercial scale hazelnuts or raspberries or blueberries or what have you. But we think that there are interesting and important things that you can find out by studying gardens, which is one of the reasons that I work with this organization, Niche, the National Initiative for Consumer Horticulture, which is working to better unite industry, nonprofit, and academia to support research and extension in consumer horticulture. It's also why I launched what I call the Garden Ecology Lab. We study gardens, we study the plants, insects, animals, you and your decisions and what it means for pollinator health, for native plants, and urban soils, as I mentioned, Michael's project. I'm going to be talking about our pollinator project today. Next month, Aaron Anderson, who is a PhD student in my lab, is going to be talking about his research on native plants, and I quickly mentioned Michael's research on urban soils. So what do we know about garden bees based upon previous research? Well, if I look at all of the studies that have collected bees from a home or community garden and have had the taxonomic expertise to identify those bees to the level of species, we know that there are at least 213 species of bee which have been collected from a garden. This number has probably gone up. There have been 2 or 3 studies that have come out since the last time I compiled this data, and I just haven't had a chance to update my spreadsheet yet. Not only are there a diversity of bees that can be found in home and community gardens, but some of them are arguably rare or yet undiscovered. So here's a story that came out in the New York Times in 2011, city bees newly discovered, yet here all along. This particular photo is a picture of Lasioglossum gotham, the Gotham city bee, or the New York City bee. This particular bee was collected by John Asher in the Brooklyn borough of New York City, and it ended up being a new species. Right about the same time, I was working at Fordham University in New York City, and we also collected a bee from a Westchester County garden that had never been described by science before, Lasioglossum asheri. So to me, it shows that even in some of the most populated regions of the United States, New York City and New York City suburbs, there are bees and other things probably that have yet to be collected and described by science. So that's pretty exciting to me as well. Just a quick spreadsheet of those 7 studies that have collected bees from gardens, community gardens or home gardens, and have had them identify to the level of species. I just want to point out that there's a little bit of a geographic bias in these studies. There was an initial study that came out of Phoenix, Arizona, the 2 studies that my lab group when I was at Fordham worked on. And then there are a couple of studies that Gordon Frankie's research group has worked on out of California. And then Stacy Philpott had another study that she conducted in Ohio. So we do know a fair amount about garden bees from these 7 studies, but there's a little bit of a geographic, well, there are a lot of areas that we haven't sampled bees from yet, and we don't really know about those garden bees that can be found in other areas, including Oregon, which is one of the reasons why I started our project. We know that even though there are 213 total bee species that have been collected from a garden, the max that have been collected from any one set of garden studies is 110. So this is Evelyn Fettridge's study of suburban New York City gardens. There are some bees that can be found in just about every study, no matter where it was conducted. Of course, no big surprise, Apis mellifera, the European honeybee, Megachila rotundata, another exotic bee, this one a leaf-cutting bee. But here, Halictus ligatus, the ligated sweat bee, is native to North America and is broadly distributed across all of these garden studies. So I looked at the ecological characteristics of these different garden bees to try to see if there's anything that we can discover if we compare bees that have been collected from a garden to bees that have been collected in comparable studies that were not in a garden. So here are urban studies, but they were done kind of like in urban patches or vacant land, a couple of forest bee studies, and a couple of farm bee studies. The first thing that I noticed is that comparing the non-garden studies to the garden studies, gardens tended to have significantly fewer andrenid bees, which are here in the gray bars. Now, andrenid bees are kind of spring ephemeral foragers. They come out for just like a hot second in the early spring. They tend to have strong associations with the region's native plants in an area, and then they disappear for the rest of the year. So compared to non-garden sites, the garden sites had significantly fewer andrenid bees, and this was not a function of bias towards sampling, like the garden study sampled later in the summer when you would not catch these spring flying bees. I suspect that it's a function of gardens having fewer native plants in bloom early in the spring when these bees are flying and foraging, or gardens not providing some other resources that these bees need in order to survive. Now, the second thing that I noticed when I looked at bees from gardens versus non-gardens is that gardens had significantly fewer soil nesting bees compared to these comparable analogous non-garden studies. Gardens also had significantly more cavity nesting bees compared to these non-garden analogies. And so what I think is going on here is that for the fewer soil nesting bees, gardens in general, if we go by the way that gardens have traditionally been landscaped, don't provide a lot of habitat resource for soil nesting bees. Gardeners love flowers, and so they'll plant every available space with flowers, and where you don't have flowers, there tends to be a lot of mulch. And so if you're covering up all of the available soil that these soil nesting bees could potentially use as habitat, you are going to be excluding these bees from your garden. And I'll return to that a little bit later in the talk, talking about some garden setups that are welcoming to these soil nesting bees. Now, gardens tended to have more cavity nesting bees compared to non-gardens. I think that what's going on there is that the cavity nesting bees are taking advantage of anthropogenic or human-provided things that they can nest in. So for example, in the Madison et al. Study in New York City community gardens, Kevin Madison was my PhD student at Fordham. He actually observed cavity nesting bees that were nesting in silk flowers that had been planted in some of these community gardens in East Harlem. So it just shows that some of these cavity nesting bees are really flexible in what they're able to use for habitat. And if we consider the typical garden and the number of things that we put in those gardens, I think that there are a lot of potential cavities that these bees could be utilizing, making gardens a happy home for them. So when I think about gardeners and their potential to provide habitat for bees, I always come back to this study, which was a real game changer for me. This particular study was conducted by David Lowenstein, Kevin Madison, who moved on to Chicago, and Emily Miner, who was the lead scientist for this particular lab. What David, Kevin, and Emily did is they actually constructed mobile gardens. So they put a lot of flowering plants in the back of a pickup truck, and they drove around to different neighborhoods in Chicago, and they timed and counted the number of bees that visited these mobile gardens in a pickup truck that they'd set up. And what they found was really amazing to me. They found that they had the highest numbers of bee abundance and the highest number of bee species richness, which is the number of total bee species, in the Chicago neighborhoods that had the highest human population density. So to me, this was such a game changer because it was the first time, to my knowledge, that humans had been found to have a positive benefit on an ecosystem service. In this case, the ecosystem service would be the pollination that is conferred by the bees in these Chicago neighborhoods. Now, David and his colleagues suggested that the reason bees did better where you had more people is because where you have more people, you have more gardens, and where you have more gardens, you have more flowers, and when you have more flowers, you have more bees. And this is something that we see repeatedly across many different studies. Here's a graph that came out of Kevin Madison's PhD research where he looked at the number of bee species and the number of butterfly species that were associated with gardens that had different levels of floral abundance. So floral abundance is down there on the x-axis. And what he found, and what many other people have confirmed since that time, is that if you have more flowering plants, you have more pollinators. And Kevin estimated that for every 11 square meters of flower that you plant, you're going to get an additional species of bee. And for every 25 meters squared of flowers that you plant, you're going to get an additional species of butterfly. Now, most home gardeners don't have the luxury of being able to turn over 25 square meters of their yard into a wildflower meadow or into an ornamental flower bed. So one of the questions that we're really interested in now, but we don't have the answer to yet, is what is the cumulative effect of your small patch of flowering plants combined with your neighbor's small flowering plant patch? What's the cumulative effect of all of these little small beds of ornamental flowers across a neighborhood? We don't know yet. What we do know is that if you plant more flowers, you're going to get more pollinators. And I'll say that for this particular study conducted in New York City, Kevin looked at the identity of the flowers. He looked at native versus exotic status. It really did not matter in this particular study. It was just plant more flowering plants, you're going to get more pollinators. Now, other people have found that native plants do matter, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. Okay, so I just want to set it up to say that we know that flowering plants are good for pollinators, and if you plant more flowering plants, you're going to get a greater diversity of pollinators in your garden. But we also know from previous research that gardens act to filter out particular bee species from the regional species pool, all potential bees that can be in your garden, to those bees that actually are able to persist in a city, to those bees which are actually able to persist in your particular garden. So here's what we know about those bees that make it into the city. We know that those bees which have the broadest regional distribution are going to be most likely to persist in urban areas. We know that larger bees tend to replace smaller bees as you get into the cities and suburbs. We know that diet generalist, those bees which can take nectar and pollen from a wide array of flowers, no matter their genus, are more likely to persist, compared to those bees which can only take nectar and pollen from a few specialized types of flowers. We've also learned that those bees which are better able to tolerate stress, in particular heat, are going to be more likely to be able to persist in urban areas. So what about those bees that are in your own local garden? Here we know the driver is flowering plant diversity and abundance. Go ahead, Brooke.
Hey, Gail. So we're just having a little issue with your slide. It's nothing you can change right now, but could you read just the bottom part of your slides? Because I think it's getting cut off for some people.
Okay.
So what we can see maybe starts your bottom circle, local insect community, and then below that is cut. So would you just mind making sure to just read that, and then we'll have the recording later for people.
Oh no, I'm sorry, folks.
It's okay. Yep. Thanks.
Okay. So really you're not missing much here. It basically says local insect community composition. So whether or not bees make it into the cities or suburbs, larger bees that can take nectar and pollen from a broad array of flowers, no matter that flowering plant genus, and bees which are tolerant of heat. Whether or not they persist in your own garden, it's going to be a function of your flowering plant diversity and abundance, as well as the complexity of your garden. Do you have plants and trees and shrubs that are at different heights? And is your garden in a hot spot in the city, or are you in a cooler region of the city? Those gardens which tend to be in cooler areas tend to have a broader array of bees. Okay, so what do we know about garden bees based upon previous research? We know that gardens can host a diversity of bees, including rare bees and new discoveries. We know that flowering plant abundance is driving both bee abundance and diversity. But we also have data to show that gardens filter bees to some extent, such that cavity nesting bees are replacing soil nesting bees, generalist bees are replacing specialists, large bees are replacing small bees, and heat-tolerant bees are replacing more sensitive bees. And at the bottom here I have, we don't know anything about Oregon's garden bees, which is why we set out to sample Oregon's garden bees. So this year and last year, we've been sampling 24 gardens in the Portland metro area of Western Oregon. The sites were selected based upon the following criteria. Basically, I went to a master gardener meeting and I said, hey, is anybody interested in participating in this study? We had about 115 people respond. I made sure that property owners knew that you're basically inviting us to hang out in your backyard for a period of time for the next 3 summers, so make sure you're okay with that. I also chose the garden study sites based upon their in-garden plantings, and here I wanted gardens that had very low flowering plant abundance to those which had very high flowering plant abundance. I also chose gardens which had a diversity of flowering plants versus those that tended to specialize on just a few particular plant types. I also chose gardens based upon what was in the surrounding landscape, if they were in an urban area, if they were next to Forest Park in Portland, or if they were in a Portland suburb. To address a separate question I have about the contributions of garden pollinators to commercial cropping systems, I also chose gardens based upon their proximity to different commercial crops. And because it takes so long to drive through all of these different garden sites, I chose gardens which made a reasonable driving route. So when we go out to sample garden bees, it takes us 4 days to conduct the sampling. And each day is about 4 to 6 hours, depending upon Portland traffic in the car. So we really tried to make this as easy as possible for us. And I did mention to Isabella when we were out this year that honestly, I think that our greatest research innovation is we finally found a driving route which minimizes how long we're just stuck sitting and waiting in traffic. So how do we sample for bees? We take advantage of the fact that bees are attracted to certain colors. They really love yellows. So here you can see a wood anemone here. This is what we see as the yellow flower. If you expose that flower to UV light, it basically turns into a target. That's what the bee sees. And that red spot there is basically telling the bee, all the nectar is here, come here. Bees are also attracted to UV colors, and we can actually see this on several flowers such as this crane's gill and this pansy, which have these purple markings, which are known as nectar guides. They're basically telling the bee, fly here, land here. This is where you're going to find what you're looking for. And so our research is incredibly high tech. I buy bowls at the dollar store and we paint them with UV blue paint or UV yellow paint. I also have white bowls, once again from the dollar store, that we just set out in a garden. These bowls are filled with a dilute solution of soapy water. The bees are attracted to the color. They land on the water. Since it has some soap in the water, it breaks the surface tension when they land, and they fall through and die. So we go back 24 hours after setting these traps out, and we collect the contents, and we put the contents in these little Whirl-Pack bags so that they're preserved with ethyl alcohol. And then Isabella does the hard job of pinning and labeling all of the bees. And just to show you, this is what we have to go through for the 2018 samples, which is why I'm indebted to Isabella beyond belief. Okay, we also, very high tech, since we're working in people's gardens, we don't use insect nets. That would damage the flowers and that would make us unwelcome guests in people's gardens. So I use this device right here, which is known as an aspirator, to suck the bees off of the flowers. And then for the larger bees, we basically catch them in a baby food jar and once again bring them back to the lab so that they can be pinned and then shipped off to the museum for identification. So incredibly high tech here. Just a shot of the lab. A shot of the June bees that we collected in baby food jars and by those aspirators that Isabella has already pinned. You can kind of see we have a specimen number associated with each one. These are temporary labels. We'll put the permanent labels on later, but we have collected about 1,600 bees, which means that Isabella has collected about 1,600 bees, which is amazing. Thank you if you're listening. Okay, so initial observations from our garden bee studies in Oregon. No big surprise, sunnier, flower-rich gardens have more bees. Gardeners which are more tolerant of bare soil have more bees. There are some bees which are broadly distributed across every garden, and these include the ligated sweat bee, the European honeybee, and then the yellow-faced bumblebee. Some things that I was not expecting is that it seems like those gardeners who are using overhead irrigation have depressed bee abundance and diversity compared to those gardeners who are using drip irrigation. Now, those gardeners who are using overhead irrigation, they tend to have more turf in their garden as well, so it may be correlated with turf area. That's something we're going to try to tease out more in the future. But ultimately, one of the things that has come through is that if you do plant it, they will come. Here is data from our 27 bee collections. These are bees which were collected in pan traps. On the x-axis is the size of the garden in acres. On the y-axis is cumulative bee abundance. So one thing you'll notice is that most of the gardens were really clustered around 0.2, 0.3, 0.4 acres. And that's because we're working in urban gardens, which tend not to have a lot of land area. But we did have a couple of larger studies, larger study sites of 3+ acres. And in general, this is something that we see in biology over and over again. The larger your habitat, the more animals you're going to be able to hold in that habitat. No big surprise. So I'm going to remove those gardens which are greater than 3 acres. And we still see the same general relationship if we're only looking at the small gardens. The larger the garden, the more bees you're going to have. But this particular garden, Site 51, is really intriguing to me. It is an urban garden, one of our most urban gardens, and one of our smallest gardens. It's only on a 0.1 acre lot, but it had the second highest abundance of bees. Now, if I look at an overhead shot of Site 51, here it is kind of on our map of pins. It's in North Portland, NOPO for those people that are in Portland. Here is an overhead satellite shot of this study site with a big oval of it to try to preserve this person's anonymity to some degree. A lot of master gardeners who are in the Portland area, they're like, oh, I totally know whose garden that is. Some things I want to point out. I-5 is 3 blocks from this garden. Killingsworth is just a couple of blocks from this garden. Here's the Mac station running right by, like literally less than a block from this garden. So this is one of our most urban gardens. It is one of our smallest gardens, but it had the second highest bee abundance. And this is because this particular gardener is focused really heavily on gardening for pollinators. Each and everything they put into their garden, if it's on a pollinator-friendly list, they will include it, such as this anise hyssop, borage, California poppy, nodding onion, big leaf maple. And then you'll also notice this particular gardener does have bare soil, does not overhead irrigate, uses drip only, and doesn't always use drip. So a lot of the plants that they have are drought tolerant, drought resistant. So that suggests to me that if you plant it, the bees will come, which is promising. So the bees from 2017 are currently at the American Museum of Natural History being identified by Sarah Kornbluth, and thank you once again, Oregon Master Gardener Association, $3 to identify every bee, helping us to get our bees identified. And one thing I'll note is that a lot of where we expect the diversity of Oregon's bees to be, such as the leaf-cutting bees and a lot of the sweat bees, they have barely Sarah has barely started to identify those. One note is when we got the initial list back from Sarah, she noted that Lasioglossum pacificum was collected from one of our gardens. I was super excited about this particular bee because it has only been collected 3 times in Oregon, and the last time it was collected in Oregon was 1938. So it's kind of like almost discovering this lost gem of a bee. Then, of course, I talked to Lincoln Best, who's a taxonomist who's doing contract work for the Oregon Bee Atlas, and I told him about Lasioglossum pacificum and how excited I was about it. And he was like, oh, you should come see other bees that have been collected that are at the Oregon State Arthropod Collection. We have hundreds of bees in our collection. So I was kind of like, not as excited about it at that time. But it does go to show the importance of sharing biodiversity databases across platforms. The platform that I was using is called Discover Life, which pulls in biodiversity data from multiple sources, and apparently the Oregon State Arthropod Collection does not contribute to that database. So we have at least 20 species of bees collected from Portland Gardens thus far. Not too shabby if we look at the number of bee species that have been collected from other garden studies. And remember that a lot of where the biodiversity is expected to be have yet to be identified: the sweat bees, the leafcutter bees, the longhorn bees. So we're super excited about what we can find. Just a quick tour of some of the bees that we have found. Bumblebees, we think we have 4 species of bumblebees. Bombus vosnesenskii is the most abundant by far, but we also have Bombus mixtus, Bombus melanopygus, which is a spring-flying bumblebee, Bombus oppositus as well. These are native bees. There is one non-native bee that's gotten free in the Pacific Northwest. It escaped from a greenhouse. They were shipped there for tomato pollination, and they have escaped and are increasing more so in Washington than in Oregon, but you might occasionally find them in Oregon. They're generalists, so they take nectar and pollen from a broad array of flowering plants, and they are hive nesters in the ground. Bombus vosnesenskii, the yellow-faced bumblebee, is by far the most abundant. We found it in every single garden that we've sampled. You can notice them by this yellow stripe on the tip, near the tip of their abdomen, and these nice yellow furry faces. But Bombus mixtus, we've also found the fuzzy horn bumblebee, which honestly to me looks like a little yellow teddy bear. I absolutely adore these bees. They're much smaller than Bombus vos, and if we go through how gardens might filter bees, larger bees replacing smaller bees, this kind of falls in line what we would expect, the larger Bombus vos being more abundant than the smaller Bombus mixtus. Anthidium manicatum, another non-native bee that takes nectar and pollen from a broad array of flowers. These are cavity nesters. They are solitary. They're called the wool carder bee because they use these combs on their hind leg to scrape the fuzz off of lamb's ear flowers, and they take that fuzz back to their nest to kind of like feather their nest, if you will. Folks oftentimes, when they see this very robust bee flying around, might initially mistake it as a yellow jacket, but we can see that it's a lot furrier than a yellow jacket and also has a stout hind leg, which is one of the discriminating characteristics between bees and wasps. Bees have a thick hind leg, whereas wasps have a very skinny hind leg. Melisodes, oh, I love these so much. These are the longhorn bees. They like asters, and so that's one of the things, if you want to be bee friendly, plant more asters, plant more sunflowers, plant more Doug aster. They really like asters. I love these bees because the females, they literally just get drunk with pollen. You can see that her hind leg has a pollen collecting basket that literally makes her look like she's wearing baggy sweatpants, her MC Hammer pants. Those thick hind legs covered with pollen are really diagnostic for the longhorn bees. They're called the longhorn bees because the males have these very long antennae. And you'll notice that the male, by comparison, really does not have that pollen collecting basket. Remember, it's the females that collect pollen so that they can feed it to their young. Bees are, to some degree, really good mothers who provision food for their young. But if I look at the front face of this longhorn bee, it's just, I love this gold clypeus. That's the name of the part of the face. It's just gorgeous to me. They're absolutely stunning bees. These metallic green bees, Agopastomum virescent, the virescent green bee are another native. They also like asters. On my computer here, it's showing that I'm covering this photo of what the nest looks like. But what the nest looks like is it really looks like an anthill. They say that you can recognize these soil nesting bees by a tumulus, and a tumulus is just a fancy word for that little hill that you see when ants make a nest as well. So they do nest underground. They're solitary, but they tolerate each other's presence, so that if we take a cutaway of what it looks like, this is about a foot underground. And here we have what an Agopastomum nest looks like when 21 females are co-nesting together. Here's what it looks like when 2 females are co-nesting together. And here's what it looks like when only a solitary female is nesting there. So they really are quite beautiful architectures underneath the soil surface, but you're not going to have them in your garden unless you have some place where they can dig and start to make those nests. Small carpenter bees, Seratina species, are very, very small. They have like a light blue kind of sheen to them. They are generalists, but there is one species in our area that specializes on Clarkia, which is the common name for that is sometimes farewell to spring. Since they're pith, they nest in pith of dead or broken twigs or stems. They are associated with gardens that have caneberries, such as raspberries. So when you prune your caneberries every fall, you're actually providing habitat for Seratina. Buckwheat, elderberry, when you prune your roses, you are actually providing habitat for Seratina bees. They are what's known as subsocial. Each female has its own nest, so when they dig into the pith, they'll lay their eggs down into the stem, and then one female will literally sit and guard the entrance of the nest. So occasionally females have been known to guard the eggs and the larvae of other bees, so youngsters which are not hers. The ligated sweat bee, Halictus ligatus, is native but can be found in just about every garden that we sample. They are true generalists and have many generations per year. They are also soil nesters. They can be eusocial or solitary, which is actually quite significant from a biological point of view, that they have the ability to go from a solitary lifestyle to a cooperative eusocial lifestyle. So oftentimes what happens is when wasps come and raid the nest and kills the mom, you can have multiple young growing up to be queens. So here's just what one nest of a eusocial group looks like from May, June, July, August. You see the nest getting bigger and bigger underground. Here's just what happens when you kill the mother of those young and you have solitary nest, just 4 different shots of 4 different bees. Leaf-cutting bees are where the majority of Oregon's bee diversity is likely to be, which is why the Oregon Bee Atlas is focusing on leafcutter bees as well as bumblebees, because they're relatively easy to identify. Leafcutter bees are known for having the fuzz or pollen-collecting scapa on the underside of their abdomen. Most of Oregon's species are native, but we do have Megachile rotundata, which is an exotic leaf-cutting bee, which we've seen in many of our gardens. They're generalists, they nest in cavities, and they tend to be solitary. So where do we go next? Well, the bees are going to be identified. The 2017 bees are being identified now. Isabella, probably me too, probably maybe just Isabella, is going to work on pinning and labeling the 2018 bees. We have maps of each garden and plant lists that we're developing, so we're going to try to start seeing relationships between garden characteristics and bee diversity. In 2019, I've changed my schedule so that I can actually have intense sampling effort in the spring to see if I can get some andrenid spring flying bees. My teaching schedule for the last 2 years has been prohibitive for spring collecting. We're also going to put out some trap nests, which look a little bit like this, to look at colonization in the spring, and we're going to try to nail down whether or not overhead irrigation indeed is depressing bee abundance and diversity. So I'm going to finish up with some recommendations for bee-friendly gardens. Flowers, probably not too difficult to sell to you gardeners, that if you want more bees in your garden, plant more flowering plants. Go for a variety of floral colors and shapes. Make sure you have blooms all year long. I will tell you that we've noticed that the sunflowers and the asters are real heavy hitters for the unique bees in the gardens we've been sampling. If you have all shade, or if you are in the middle of a forest, you probably are not going to get that many bees. So try to give them forage in an area which receives a lot of sun. Should go without saying, but reduce or eliminate pesticides. See if you can incorporate bare ground or bare soil for the soil nesters. Twigs and cavities, if you are feeling guilty about your pruning pile of twigs that you have not cleaned up for a year or so, stop feeling guilty, because we found that those are fantastic habitat for cavity nesting bees. And I think that the drought tolerant plants and drip irrigation is key as well, but I'm going to look into that more intensively next year. Bees like yellows, blues, and whites, try to include those in your plant palette. Sunflowers and farewell to spring are key if you want to hit any of our local specialist bees to get those special bees in your garden instead of just having bumblebees and honeybees. And look for a variety of flower architectures. Dug asters and other asters, tubular flowers, cup-like flowers, and I do have a list of recommended pollinator plants on our blog, which I think Brooke is going to make available with the this particular recording. So just a note about bee-friendly plants. California poppy, nepeta, which is sometimes called catmint or catnip, and Perovskia, those are all plants that I recommended in the past for bee-friendly gardens. But I will tell you that what we've noticed is that California poppy is totally dominated by bumblebees, and the bumblebees are so good at taking all of the resources from California poppy that they kind of exclude the other bees. Nepeta and Perovskia, you will find tons of honeybees and bumblebees on those plants, but you tend not to find those special bees, those native bees, the lasioglossum, the agapostumum. They're not as abundant on those plants. Aaron Anderson is going to be giving a webinar next month where he is going to present the results of his research looking at 20 plus species of Willamette Valley natives and the pollinators that they are known to attract. Aaron will tell you more next month, but just a little preview. The flowers that he found to be most attractive to bees are Globegilia, Gilia capitata, Clarkia menia, Farewell to Spring, Doug Aster, which I cannot say enough good things about Doug Aster if you're an Oregon gardener. It's a native. It is one of the few flowers which is still in active bloom in most of our gardens without supplemental irrigation, and the bees love it. So Aster subspicatus, and then goldenrod, Solidago canadensis, which I know a lot of gardeners do not like goldenrod because it can grow a little unwieldy, but there were a couple of gardens that we sampled that are 0.1 acre plus or minus a few feet, where they've successfully incorporated goldenrod into their garden plans. It looks great. It attracts tons of bees and tons of those unique bees. Okay, so things based upon our observations that I want to suggest that you give them a try if you have not already. Doug aster. I love it. It's so beautiful. And it's still blooming right now without supplemental irrigation, which a lot of garden plants have dried up by this time in the year. Oregon is in significant drought right now, and a lot of plants have just kind of shut up shop for the season. Asters in general, sunflowers, black-eyed Susan, we find a lot of unique special bees on those plants as well. Alyssum, hyssop, borage, once again, bee heavy hitters, and you're not just getting the bumblebees and the honeybees, you're getting special bees. Just a couple more, and I'm very close to finishing, I promise. I do want to give a note about bee nesting habitat, and just a reminder that globally about 70% of bees nest underground. Remember I showed you that gardens tend to exclude the soil nesting bees, and this is going back to our New York City research and our Westchester County research, but we found that soil nesting bees tend to be depressed the more urban that you get. And that's because soil nesting bees need soil, and when you have limited land on which to garden, soil is probably not what you're hoping to welcome into your garden. So on the right-hand side here, I have a picture of kind of like an unmanaged area in one of the gardens that we sample. This particular gardener has not been able to garden as much as they wanted to this past year for a couple of different reasons. And when they followed us out to the garden to look at what we were collecting, and we were showing them, like, look at how much we're getting from your garden, they were like, how is that even possible? I barely spend any time on this garden. But when I started pointing out, look at all of these soil nesting bee nests in this unmanaged area right there, it actually helped them feel pretty good about how their garden's been performing, even though they were not able to put as much time into the garden. Cavity nesting bees, this is just a little decorative thing that I saw in one of the gardens that we work in. Beautiful, probably not great for nesting bees. Here is the backyard of one of the gardens that we sample, gravel, all in the backyard. One of the reasons I chose this garden is because they have a fire pit in the back with a wood pile, and I was interested in whether or not bees would be nesting in the wood pile. They are not. This garden is not one of our better bee gardens, and I think it's the combination of shade as well as all of the gravel, excluding the soil nesting bees as well as other bees. So in general, I really do love space for soil nesting bees, and I think that that's oftentimes overlooked by many gardeners, and I've kind of been poo-pooing the cavity habitat for cavity nesting bees in some of the talks I've given in the past. But here is an example of a pollinator barn, if you will, that's on the campus of OSU, and they just have different cutouts for different pollinator nesting, cavity nesting pieces. So here's just log ends that have been drilled with different drill bits, and you can see that they have been effectively colonized by cavity nesting bees. Up here, they actually have cut off wine bottles with some bamboo, and you can see that cavity nesting bees have effectively colonized this bamboo. And then here, they have some wood blocks. The grass that's coming out of them tells me that these have been colonized by grass-cutting wasps, not bees, but still beneficial insects, and it's attractive. So it's something that I think could be a model for other gardens as well. So just to recap, if you want a bee-friendly garden, plant more flowering plants. Don't stress too much about the particular identity of those plants. If you can find space for sunflowers or Doug aster, that would be great. But really just focus on getting more plants that are in flower all year long. Remember, Doug aster is still actively in flower right now in the middle of extreme drought in Oregon, even without supplemental irrigation. They need sunlight. If you totally just have a shade garden, you might get some unique bees, but you're probably not going to get a lot of bees. Reduce or eliminate pesticides. Consider providing bare ground space consider providing twigs and other cavities, or maybe not being as neat with your pruning pile, and then incorporate a drought-tolerant area into your garden if you can. And this is our lab group. Thank you for attending today, and that's all I have to formally share.
Great. Thank you so much, Gail. You don't get to hear all the applause, but I'm sure everyone is clapping. So we are right at the edge of our time, but there are some questions. So what we're going to do is, if you have questions, put them into the Q&A box. We'll spend a few minutes here asking some questions of Gail on her presentation, and then other questions that we're not able to answer live, I'll work with Gail to get some of those answers, and we'll get them posted for you. So if that's all right, Gail, we'll go through and just look at this list of questions. And a couple of folks are curious about bare soil. Like, what does bare soil mean? Just soil? Can you have some leaves? You know, we're always taught as gardeners that you want to protect the soil from erosion. And so leaves, mulch, anything, or just bare soil?
So bare soil is great. So my impression is that you can have a light mulch of organic materials such as light leaves, light plant debris. If you're doing 2 to 4 inches thick of coarse woody mulch, that is going to be too much for most bees to get through. They're not going to be able to dig through that to get to the soil that they need to nest.
Great. So Janet wants to know, maybe you can just reiterate how you can tell that you have those nesting bees. You had a term for that structure.
Right, so how can you tell if you have those nesting bees? One thing to do is when they're flying around the ground, honestly, just watch them and see where they go. But the term is a tumulus, and tumulus is just a fancy science word for anthill. So it looks very much like an anthill, kind of like that little dome that an anthill has, except the hole is going to be larger than an anthill hole.
Great. A couple of questions on just your study design. And so Christina wants to know that when you were selecting your sites, you listed out a couple of different factors, you know, how you chose those sites. Did you look into anything about pesticide use of those individual gardeners?
Right. Did I look into pesticide use? I did not. The reason I did not look into pesticide use is because I found from previous attempts to quantify this that folks don't necessarily honestly report pesticide use, quite frankly, and that folks don't necessarily understand what their pesticide use is. So I do take notes if any of our gardeners are online. Things that I can observe. If I see a sprayer in your backyard, I'm making note that I see a sprayer in your backyard, but I'm not asking them what they're spraying, in part because that goes to human subject research that I'd have to take through our institutional review board, so I'm trying to avoid that. Or if you are talking to me while I'm sampling your garden and you're telling me that you never use pesticides except for imidacloprid, which you use to treat that Doug fir tree, then I'm writing that down as well because you're volunteering that. But it's hard to capture pesticide use. And so I did not formally include that in the study design.
Great. Todd wants to know about how maybe the availability of having a water source or clay. So like with mason bees, they need this clay for their nest. Any sort of general thoughts that you've run across?
Right, so the importance of having a water source. I actually think that's why gardens have been even more important to bees this year. So for those of you who are not in Oregon, Oregon is in extreme drought right now. And what that means, or what we've observed, is that there are fairly high concentrations of bees in the gardens that we're sampling. And I suspect that's because the gardens are being irrigated and are providing resources, not only water, but flowering plants in bloom that the bees can't get in the surrounding landscape. The availability of water itself. We see honeybees going to water features. We see a lot of yellow jackets going to water features. We are not seeing the smaller native bees go to water features. Now, the availability of clay. The Willamette Valley of Oregon Our state soil is actually a Jory soil, which is a clay soil. So there is no lack of clay soils in the gardens that I'm sampling.
Right. And I was going to say, I think you're probably going to have, like, whoever has stock in the Doug Astor seed is going to probably have a big run after this presentation.
Sorry.
Right?
Yeah, it'll be.
I know I'm going to put it on my list.
It's so beautiful, and it's in bloom right now. And Aaron will talk about it, I hope, when he talks next month. But a lot of these plants are really difficult to find in nurseries, and that's part of what we're hoping to change, is to make sure gardeners know about them, but also encourage nurseries to offer them.
Great. So there's quite a few questions on herbicide use and how that might affect bees. And so we do have a webinar scheduled in December. It hasn't been announced yet, but we're going to have a webinar just on herbicide use in home gardens. And so, I mean, if you want to comment on anything that you might want to comment on that topic, but we're going to go in depth in that in December as well.
Okay, so herbicide use. I suspect that gardeners who are more tolerant of lawn weeds are going to have more diverse and abundant bees. And in fact, in some of our gardens, which are not providing a lot of other resources for bees right now, we were only able to pick bees off of their dandelions for this August sample. So honestly, if you want to feel a little bit better about lazy gardening practices, dandelions and clover and the lawn are some of our go-to sites to collect some of these more obscure, rare herbies. And if you're using herbicides, you probably are not going to have a lot of these weedy plants around, which are going to provide less resource for these bees.
Great. I know. I think we need to have a sign that says it's for the bees. Don't judge me. I put them in my yard.
I know. So in our own yard, we have weeds in our lawn, and our neighbors can't believe that I work in horticulture, but part of the reason is because the dandelions are so great for the bees.
Right. All right, so we're at our time. I know there's a few questions coming in, but again, we're going to answer those, and we'll get those posted either to you directly, or we'll have them posted on the Learn page, the splash page for this. So the webinar series, just a few notes, the webinar series is taking September off, but we're going to be back on October 22nd, and this is the talk that Aaron is giving on his research on native plants in the Pacific Northwest garden. This is something new we're doing. Aaron is a graduate student, and he's going to share just some tidbits of his research. And look for an email with an evaluation of this survey, and then you will be added to a listserv that will let you know of all those upcoming events that we have coming up. And so thanks, everybody, and we will see you back here in October.
And Brooke, I'll put a link in chat. That's for the Learn event. And Gail, if you're okay with it, I can take, since there were some issues with the PowerPoint, not quite seeing all of it, if you're willing to share your PowerPoint, we can convert it to a PDF and make it available for folks, somebody, just in case folks want to
Sure.
go back.
I'll send that right over to you.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Gail. Appreciate it. Thanks everybody.
Everyone.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye, Virginia.